Today, India is one of the leading markets in the mobile and communication technology industry. The leap seen in the communication sector in a short span of 2 decades has left the prophets of communication dumbfounded. The changes in technology, from the invention of the telegraph to satellite links, connect people across the globe at the flick of a switch. Not only this, the internet chats and news flashes are possible on your mobile phones. Can you imagine a world without the internet, mobile phones or other online explorers? Well, in today's lecture, I will make you aware of the transition from a world without the presence of mass media to a world congested with communication technology. So, the focus of today's lecture is on tracing the early forms of communication from the beginning of organized society in India, the beginnings of written communication in India, the growth of the print media in India, the role of newspapers in the 19th century, the press and the freedom movement in India. The evolution and systematic growth of communication can be traced over a span of centuries. Beginning with the early era when language and writing were not developed, man used to express himself through symbols of sounds and gestures. He grunted, screamed, frowned and waved his arms and even used physical force to make his meanings known to others. There was no organized method through which he could communicate. Later, as the primitive man roamed the land, he discovered a new way to communicate. While he was moving from one place to another, he learned to leave landmarks such as piles of stones or cuts on trees to guide him on his return. It took nearly 5 lakh years to advance from purely oral communication to the earliest writings on the clay tablets and other cave drawings. Writing made it possible for man to transmit his messages to many people. Without direct contact, writing allowed man to record his history, work of art and knowledge for the present and future generations. Books were copied word for word by monks or lay writers on animal membrane, which took months to produce and were very expensive. By 900 AD, schools, monasteries and works of art were communicating man's formal history and knowledge. Messages were written on leaves and stones, preserved as visual relics, reflect the symbolic representation of that era. Then, early man's tradition and culture were conveyed from tribe to tribe and generation to generation by reenacting historical events. In this way, theatre developed. Early Indians were famous for their plays. Messages and ideas were transmitted by the means of dance, puppet shows and other folk forms. Another feature of communication in ancient India was the emphasis placed on oral and oral systems. Learned people were called Bahusrut and these were the people who heard and memorized a lot. Writing was done on palm leaves using a stylus and the written documents were considered too sacred to be touched or used by the lower class. In ancient India, the kings and the rulers are known to have propagated their ideas through edicts. Their messages were inscribed on walls and edicts erected at strategic points for people to read. Soon, the kings and rulers realized that it was important for them to acquaint themselves with those activities which were against their authority. Agencies were created to deal with these activities. These agencies also spread out their proclamations of social reforms, economic reforms to their authorities. They also provided information on conditions in the prosperous and backward areas. Organized attempts were made to relieve famine and distress by releasing timely relief. In the earlier stages of these activities, information was transmitted verbally and later it was reduced to writing. During the period of Emperor Ashoka, the state supported itself with a highly developed administration. Sources of information ranged from spies who reported on subversive activities, the secret overseers attached to every department and an account of the socio-economic activities of the people from the monasteries. Another important tool of communication was the newsletter which kept the ruler informed of the developments in various parts of the country. During the Mughal period, news writers were specially appointed and were made to file reports to the headquarters of the administration. The news writers worked in liaison with the governor or a local administrative official, presenting them in a favourable light to the central authority. Records from history show conflicting reports about the status of the press during Aurangzeb's time. One shows that the emperor allowed great liberty in matter of news, while another ascribes his failure to realize that false reports were sent to him by his news writers. Later, the East India Company requisitioned the services of news writers for the same purpose as during the Mughal period. Mostly, reports were confined to the affairs of the English, and occasionally the grievances of the employees were ventilated through this channel. For a number of reasons, the news writers were subject to a greater control as compared to the Mughal period. The first attempt to start a newspaper in India was made in Calcutta in 1776 by William Bolles, who was an ex-officer of the East India Company. He resigned following a censure by the directors of the company for carrying on private trade beyond the company's authority. Bolt announced that he would start a career in writing, and this manuscript would communicate many things most intimately to every individual. This gave rise to an alarm in the official headquarters. He was directed to quit Bengal. Thus, the first attempt at journalism proved abortive. It was then in 1780 that James Augustus Hickey started the Bengal Gazette Calcutta General Advertiser. This two-sheet newspaper devoted considerable space to scurrilous attacks on the private lives of the officials of the company, including the Governor General, a colonel and a Swedish missionary. As it is, Hickey did not enjoy a high reputation in the company. Soon, Hickey landed in trouble and his paper was deprived of the privilege of circulating his newspaper through the General Post Office. He was later sued for libel and was sentenced to imprisonment, including a fine. In spite of this, he continued his critical, bitter and abusive attacks on the Governor General and the Chief Justice. While in prison, he continued to edit his paper without changing its tone. Attacks continued on Hickey, but he remained undeterred. He persisted in his writings, but was gradually reduced to poverty and distress, which ultimately broke him. In 1780, another publication, the India Gazette, was started by Messrs. B. Messing and Peter Reed. The basic difference between Hickey and these two writers was that they obtained the consent of the Governor General and then addressed him in writing for postal concessions. They also assured him that they would abide by any regulations laid down by the company. The Calcutta Gazette was published in 1784 under the direct patronage of the government, and in the following year, the Bengal Journal made its appearance along with a monthly, the Oriental Magazine of Calcutta Amusement. The Calcutta Chronicle was published in 1786. Within 6 years of maiden effort, there were 4 weekly newspapers and 1 monthly magazine from Calcutta. The Bengal Journal offered to publish all government advertisements free of charge. Nothing significant is known about the Calcutta Chronicle except for the fact that the issues are found in the Imperial Library and in the British Museum Newspaper Library. Meanwhile, Madras and Bombay were not far behind in the publishing race. The Madras Courier came into existence in 1785 as an officially recognized newspaper founded by Richard Johnson. He was a government printer. In 1791, Boyd, then editor of the Madras Courier, resigned and started the Hurkaru, but the paper ceased publication a year later when he died. The Madras Courier continued without a competitor till 17 1795 when R. Williams started the Madras Gazette. This was followed by the India Herald, which was published by authority by one Humphreys, who was arrested for the unauthorized publication, but managed to escape from the ship on which he was deported to England. Bombay's first newspaper, the Bombay Herald, made its appearance in 1789. The Courier, which was published a year later, carried advertisements in Gujarati. The Bombay Gazette was published in 1791 and the Bombay Herald was merged into it in the following year. It was recognized for the purposes of official notifications and advertisements in the same terms as the Madras Courier. In Bombay and Madras, the newspapers did not seem to have come into conflict with the government. On the contrary, they were anxious to earn official recognition and to enjoy official favor. In fact, the proprietor of the Madras Courier, Richard Johnson, secured new presses, types and material through the government free of duty. It seemed that Boyd resigned from the editorship of the Madras Courier in 1791, probably because the tone of his paper was not to the liking of the government. On two occasions on which it unintentionally offended the government, the editor readily published an apology. Interestingly, the newspaper scene in Bengal was completely different. In 1791, William Duane acquired the Bengal Journal and became its editor. He landed into trouble by publishing the rumoured death of Lord Cornwallis. Evidently, he could not continue as editor of the Bengal Journal. Subsequently, he started another paper, the Indian Herald. The paper grew steadily in the following 3 years. In the interval between 1791 and 1798, newspapers in Bengal were pulled up for various offences, mostly related to military subjects. Duane was harassed on various occasions by the government and asked to proceed to Europe. He demanded an audience with Sir John Shore, the Governor General, who invited him to the government house. It was here that he was placed under arrest and sent to England along with 3 orphan children whom he had adopted. Duane received no compensation for the property left behind in India. In 1798, Dr. Charles Maclean, who started the Bengal Harkaru, had a series of encounters, first with the Postmaster General for detaining certain letters addressed to him, and later with the government for contributing a signed letter to the Telegraph edited by Mackinlay, reflecting upon the conduct of the magistrate of Ghazipur. The editor apologized, but Maclean politely refused to do so. He was promptly deported, and on his return to England, he played an important part in the campaign against Wellesley, which led to the Governor General's resignation in 1805. Leicester Stanhope, a great champion of freedom of the press, wrote, on Lord Wellesley's return to England, Dr. Maclean published his case, and no man throughout ever behaved with greater prudence and firmness. This marked the end of a phase in journalism in India. Now, the highlights of this phase can be summed up as: there were no press laws as such. A person intending to start a paper who was already in the bad books of the government or the influential officials was deported forthwith. If a newspaper offended or was unrepentant, it was first denied postal privileges. If it persisted in causing displeasure to the government, it was required to submit part of or the entire newspaper to pre-censorship. If the editor did not mend his ways, he was deported. Now, the content of the newspapers related to the interests and the activities of the European population in India. Apart from parliamentary reports, there were editorials on subjects of interest to the resident Britons, on events in England, on the army, on the reported plans of Indian leaders. In addition to this type of information, there were newsletters and reports from Paris, Stockholm, Vienna, Madrid, China, Rio de Janeiro and other centers of interest. There were letters to the editor, government notices, social news, poets' corners, advertisements and even fashion notes. Some general conclusions that can be drawn of the press at that time are: no newspapers were published until 1780 because the company's establishments in India were a closed preserve. The first newspapers were started by disgruntled ex-employees of the company. They were aided and guided by servants of the company who used these newspapers for furtherance of their personal rivalries and jealousies. The apprehension was that these newspapers might reach London than that they might have any adverse effect in Bengal. The circulation of papers never exceeded 100 or 200, and there was no danger of public opinion being subverted. Only spare copies of newspapers published in the territory of one establishment reached other establishments, and that too occasionally. While some editors incurred the displeasure of important officials from the very beginning, some others made no beginning at all, and it was for this reason that other editors were encouraged, financed and provided with material and other aid by influential senior officials of the company. The first 2 decades of the 19th century witnessed rigid control of the press by the Marquess of Wellesley and relaxation by the Marquess of Hastings. There was a difference of opinion what the official attitude towards the press in India should be at the highest level, both in India and in London. Lord Wellesley, a dominant ruler, was challenged in different spheres by Tipu Sultan, the French and the European community in Calcutta. He avoided passing information to Tipu Sultan. He was equally determined that the European community in Calcutta should be put in its place. The editor of the Asiatic Mirror published reports showing the strength of the European and the native population. Wellesley, who regarded this speculation as likely to start trouble, wrote to the commander-in-chief promising to lay down rules for the conduct of the whole tribe of editors. He also advised him to suppress the editors of mischievous papers by force and send them back to Europe. The press regulations that followed required the newspaper to carry in imprint the name of the printer, the editor and the proprietor, to declare themselves to the secretary to the government, to submit all material published in the paper for prior scrutiny. Publication on Sunday was prohibited. The prescribed punishment for breach of these rules was immediate deportation. The secretary was vested with the powers of censure. All military information was to be excluded from the newspapers. No newspapers were permitted to publish extracts from European newspapers which were likely to constitute a breach of the above restrictions. Curiously enough, all editors agreed to comply with the rules and regulations of the government. In other words, it can be inferred that Wellesley had assumed comprehensive powers. At this time, the Baptist missionaries of Serampore were refused permission to set up a press. Soon after, Wellesley decided that the most effective way of silencing the presses for the government was to have a press of its own and print an official gazette and a newspaper. This decision could not be implemented due to the huge expenses involved. Soon it was found that newspapers were not submitting to any pre-censorship on a regular basis. Military information was also being published. The information that was forbidden to publish in newspapers was being published in books and pamphlets. Immediately, prohibitory instructions were sent to editors of 6 newspapers. The rigid instructions imposed on the press issued on April 9, 1807 led to the publication of a spate of pamphlets which bore neither the name of the author nor the printer. An order was issued requiring all presses to publish the name of the printer on all literature published from a press. The Madras order on pamphlets was even more stringent, and printing presses were required to submit the manuscripts of all their publications before they were printed. When Lord Hastings took over in 1813, Newspapers in Calcutta, Bombay and Madras were well under control, with Madras leading in the matters of stringency of regulations. Lord Hastings issued a brief instruction requiring all printing presses to submit proof sheets of newspapers, supplements, extra publications, notices or handbills to the Chief Secretary for scrutiny and revision. In the next episode, we shall be right back here to discuss the beginnings of the fight for the freedom of the press.